Guardians of the Galaxy is a franchise that I never really knew much about when it was first announced that it was getting its own MCU movie. I think that a lot of us really didn't know much about them then, aside from those who really know their material. I was used to the big ones like Iron Man and Hulk and Spider-Man, but the Guardians were more like B tier or fuck even C tier superheroes, so it was very odd to choose them for their own movie, especially that early on in the MCU. But to my surprise, and probably to the surprise of a lot of other people, it was one of the best MCU movies, even to this day, and it is my personal favorite out of the whole fucking 30 plus Marvel movies that eventually came out. It's really weird to say this about a movie like this, but this is a movie that really means a lot to me. Normally you would hear that about more classical type older movies, but this one kind of stood out to me when I first saw it. It's a movie that really hits home, especially now when I look back to it. Guardians 2 eventually came out, and it was pretty good as well. I don't think it was as good as the original, but it's still a pretty damn good movie. So when they announced that Guardians 3 was finally coming out, I had some pretty high hopes for it. And I know that doing that isn't really the best thing to do, because you kind of just set yourself up to be disappointed whenever the movie doesn't really meet your expectations. But this was one of the lucky times that it did come out the way I hoped it would. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is a fantastic movie, and one of the best MCU movies I've seen in a very long time. It was actually kind of refreshing seeing an MCU movie be good again after a lot of the last few have been kind of stinkers lately. Now, I do want to get this out of the way immediately. This is not a perfect movie. I do have some tiny nitpicks in this movie like I do with any other movie I watch, and I want to get to those in a minute, but first I do want to talk about the few things that I did like. I really like the story in this movie. It's one of those stories that really wants to pull on your heartstrings, and they're pretty effective at it. This movie also has surprisingly good structure. Like, I can pretty clearly remember how this movie starts and what things led from point A to point B, point C, and so on. I also don't want to give too much away because I don't want to say much about what the story of this movie is about. I actually didn't really know much about it going into this movie. All I really knew was that it had a lot to do with Rocket Raccoon and his backstory. But as to what is the main driving point of this movie, I had no idea what it actually ended up being. I will say this might be one of those movies to go in a little blind to what the actual plot really is. It was really surprising to me. But a fair warning to all of you, this is a little bit of a darker movie than we're normally used to seeing in the MCU. It's not like dark, but a fair amount of seemingly fucked up shit happens in this movie. There's a few kind of disturbing parts as well. One in particular that's pretty horrifying, and I really wasn't expecting like what they showed us. And when I say that this movie has to do with Rocket Raccoon and some of his backstory, I really do mean that. This is, without a doubt, a Rocket Raccoon movie. He is essentially the standout character of this movie. But honestly though, while he is the standout character of this movie, he really isn't by much, but almost every character in this movie is so fucking good. It's rare to see a movie that has a lot of characters that feel like they've all had an equal amount of love and care in them, and this is one of those rare times, it feels like. Peter Quill is really fucking going through it in this movie. I really like how his character starts out in this movie and where it leads them, though I kind of would have liked it if they've leaned just a little bit more towards the shit that was happening with his character at the beginning of the movie, but he's fine for the most part. He actually leads this movie pretty fucking well, which kind of explains why he was mid as fuck in the Mario movie. He was putting all of his actual acting talent and skills into this fucking movie. I will say, I did have an issue with Peter towards the end of this movie. Something happens that I thought was kind of stupid, and it really didn't need to happen. Like, I know why they did it, but like out of any character this could have happened to, I do think he was the worst pick of the bunch. Like, if you watch it, you'll know what I mean. I did like Nebula a lot in this movie as well. It felt like she was more of a support character in this movie to help boost a lot of the other characters, which is fine. I really didn't need her super fleshed out. We already got that from Endgame, but I liked how she was used here. If Rocket is the main building that houses the Guardians, Nebula is the foundation that is holding everything up. Mantis is a lot better in this than she was in the fucking Christmas special. I don't really know why, but it was very noticeable to me how much better she actually was, and it it was kind of fucking jarring to me. If you like Mantis, you'll like her a lot in this movie. This is probably the best she's been written in any MCU movie that she's been in. Drax is where it starts leaning towards the not as great side. Like, he's good, let me say that first, but he's not as good as the others for a lot of it. I do like where his story ultimately ends up going, but I really do wish that they kind of started building that up a lot sooner than when they actually got around to it. And then there's Groot, who's only in this movie to sell more toys. That's all I have to say about him. The main antagonist of this movie is a character that goes by the High Evolutionary, and I fucking love this character. He is the biggest piece of shit I've ever seen in a fucking MCU movie, and I could not get enough of him. He felt pretty refreshing because he's not really one of those I'm going to fucking take my revenge or I'm going to destroy or take over the fucking universe type of characters. He's really specific in what his goals are, and it really does drive the movie. And the guy who plays him is acting his fucking heart out. He goes really deep into his fucking character, and it's fucking amazing. Like, fuck Kang, bro. The fucking High Evolutionary is someone I want to see more of. He fucking says a line in this movie that goes so fucking hard, and it just tells you everything you need to know about his character. This movie also had some surprisingly good action sequences in it. At times, it is a very much balls to the wall type of action, but there are also a lot of really creative ones as well. Sometimes it feels like really fucking badass, and at other times it feels really fucking fun. There's one really standout action scene that was so fucking cool, and I do feel like it rivals a lot of the best action scenes in any MCU movie. Now, let me talk about one of the things that I didn't like as much, and I don't know if this is gonna be a hot take or not. Earlier, I said that almost every character in this movie is really good. Well, here comes the part of the reason I said almost. I wasn't really a big fan of Adam Warlock. I felt like he was written a little weaker than the rest of the characters. It's kind of weird how I think about him, because I did like how he was at the beginning when he was first introduced, and I do like him a lot more towards the end, but it's that middle part that I have a problem with. He kind of pops in here and there, but I feel like they should have used him a lot more. He's a character that the movie kind of tells you it's much more important than they actually are. Like, he is an important character, don't get me wrong, it just feels like he isn't. I know none of that makes any fucking sense, but that's the only way I can explain it. I do also feel like this movie goes on a little too long. This movie is like a whole ass 2.5 hours, and for the most part, I was pretty okay with it. The pacing is pretty good, but it does start dragging towards the very end of the movie. The ending isn't horrible, it just feels like it went on a little longer than it needed to be. One last thing before I do an overall summary. This movie does contain the first ever F-bomb in the MCU, and let me tell you that whenever it does happen, that shit gave me fucking whiplash. It felt so weird. It was used well though, but if you've seen any of the commercial spots online, then you know exactly where it happens. But even when it did happen, I still felt caught off guard. Honestly, this is a really good send-off film for the Guardians, and I really do mean it when I say send-off. This movie feels like a goodbye from the franchise, because it essentially is. With James Gunn leaving Marvel to go over to DC, I doubt they're gonna make another Guardians movie, and even if they did, I don't think it'll be the same. It could be, don't get me wrong, but I just don't think it'll be the same. So go watch Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. It's an absolute must-watch movie from a must-watch franchise that I really didn't want to say goodbye to, but I knew it had to happen eventually.